The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as James Mitchell adjusted his red uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. He had been a palace guard for 12 years, standing at attention through countless royal events, state visits, and family gatherings. The job had become routine, almost mechanical. Stand straight, look ahead, remain silent, and protect the royal family at all costs. James had joined the Queen's Guard after serving in Afghanistan. The transition from active combat to ceremonial duty had been difficult at first. The stillness, the silence, the hours of standing motionless while tourists snapped photos and sometimes tried to make him laugh or move. But over the years, he had grown accustomed to being invisible, a living statue in an elaborate costume. At 42, James lived alone in a small flat near the base. His marriage had ended 3 years earlier when his wife Sarah couldn't handle his long hours and emotional distance. She had tried to understand the toll his military service had taken on him, but the nightmares, the sudden anger, and his inability to connect had slowly eaten away at their relationship. His 2 children, Emma and Tom, now lived with their mother in Manchester. He saw them every other weekend, but even those visits felt strained and formal. The palace had become his refuge and his prison. Within these ancient walls, he knew his role perfectly. He was respected by his fellow guards, trusted by his superiors, and invisible to the royal family. That invisibility had always suited him fine. He preferred not being noticed, not having to engage, not having to pretend everything was all right when it clearly wasn't. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. James took his position at the main entrance, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, his rifle held at the precise angle required by centuries of tradition. The tourists hadn't arrived yet, and the castle grounds were peaceful. A few gardeners worked quietly in the distance, and the soft sounds of morning preparations drifted from various windows. Prince George, now 11 years old, appeared around the corner with his tutor, Mrs. Henderson. The young prince was supposed to be heading to his morning lessons, but James could see he was dragging his feet, clearly more interested in the activity around the castle than in mathematics or history. This wasn't unusual. James had observed many of the royal children over the years, watching them grow up within the confines of their privileged but restricted world. What was unusual was that Prince George stopped walking and appeared to be studying James intently. Most members of the royal family had learned to look through the guards as if they were furniture. It was an unspoken understanding that helped maintain the formal distance required by protocol. But the young prince stood there, his head tilted slightly, his intelligent eyes focused on James's face. Mrs. Henderson noticed her charge had stopped. "Your Highness, we really must get to the library for your lessons," she said gently but firmly. In a moment, Prince George replied, still looking at James. There was something in the boy's expression that James couldn't quite identify. Not curiosity exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw something that others had missed. James maintained his position, staring straight ahead as required, but he was acutely aware of the scrutiny. In all his years of service, he had rarely felt so seen. It was uncomfortable and oddly touching at the same time. He could feel the young prince's gaze like a physical weight, searching his face for something. The moment stretched on longer than it should have. Protocol demanded that James remain motionless, but every instinct told him something significant was happening. Prince George took a small step closer, and James caught a glimpse of the boy's expression in his peripheral vision. There was a maturity in those young eyes that seemed far beyond his 11 years. A wisdom that came from living under constant observation and learning to read people's true emotions beneath their public masks. "Your Highness," Mrs. Henderson said again, her tone growing more insistent, "your parents will be expecting you to complete your morning studies before the afternoon's engagements." Prince George nodded slowly but didn't immediately move. Instead, he did something that broke every rule of royal protocol. He raised his hand in a small, discreet wave directed specifically at James. Not the practiced royal wave he had been taught for public appearances, but a genuine personal gesture of acknowledgement. James felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. The simple gesture hit him harder than he could have imagined. For years he had been invisible, ignored, treated as part of the architecture. But this child, this future king, had seen him, really seen him. The wave wasn't random or playful. It was deliberate and kind, a recognition of James as a human being rather than just a uniformed guardian. Fighting every instinct and years of training, James allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but Prince George saw it and his own face brightened considerably. "Good morning," the prince said quietly. His words meant only for James, despite Mrs. Henderson's presence. James couldn't respond verbally, of course, but something in his eyes must have communicated his appreciation, because Prince George's smile widened slightly before he finally allowed his tutor to guide him away toward his lessons. As the sound of their footsteps faded, James remained at his post, but something fundamental had shifted. The invisible barrier he had built around himself, the emotional armor that had protected him from feeling too much, had developed a crack. A small one, barely noticeable but significant enough that he could feel cool air touching a part of his heart he had thought was completely sealed off. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. James found himself replaying the brief interaction over and over, analyzing every detail. The genuine warmth in the prince's eyes, the careful way he had chosen to acknowledge James's humanity, the simple kindness of a child who had been taught from birth that his actions mattered and could affect others. When James returned to his flat that evening, he sat in his usual chair by the window, but instead of turning on the television or losing himself in the bottle of whiskey he kept in the kitchen cabinet, he found himself thinking about his own children. When was the last time he had really looked at them the way Prince George had looked at him? When had he last seen them as individuals rather than reminders of his failures as a husband and father? The young prince's gesture had been small, almost invisible to anyone else who might have witnessed it. But to James it felt like a door opening after years of being locked shut. He wasn't sure what lay beyond that door, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt curious enough to find out. The following morning, James arrived at his post with an unusual sense of anticipation. He tried to dismiss the feeling, reminding himself that yesterday's encounter was likely a one-time event. Royal children were naturally curious, and Prince George had probably already forgotten about the guard who had almost smiled at him. Yet as he took his position, James found himself hoping he might see the young prince again. His hope was answered when Prince George appeared in the courtyard shortly after 9 o'clock, this time accompanied by his younger sister, Princess Charlotte, and their security detail. They were heading toward the stables for their weekly riding lesson, a routine James had observed countless times before. But today felt different because Prince George was scanning the guards positioned around the courtyard, clearly looking for someone specific. When the prince's eyes found James, his face lit up with unmistakable recognition and pleasure. This time there was no tutor to hurry him along, and the security personnel were maintaining their professional distance, allowing the children some freedom within the secure perimeter of the castle grounds. Prince George whispered something to his sister, who looked toward James with curious 8-year-old eyes. Princess Charlotte had inherited her mother's direct gaze and her father's ability to assess people quickly. She studied James for a moment, then nodded at whatever her brother had told her. Together, the two children approached James's position. This was highly irregular, and James could see the security team becoming more alert, though they didn't intervene. The children were still within the safe zone, and their approach to a vetted guard wasn't considered a security risk. "Hello again," Prince George said when he was close enough to speak quietly. His voice carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had been coached in public speaking from an early age, but there was also genuine warmth in his tone. James remained at attention, eyes forward, but he was intensely aware of both children's presence. Princess Charlotte moved to stand directly in front of him, forcing him to look down slightly to avoid meeting her gaze. "George says you looked sad yesterday," she announced with the blunt honesty that only children possess. "Are you sad because you have to stand here all day?" "I would be terribly bored." The question caught James off guard. Children's ability to see through adult pretenses never ceased to amaze him, but he hadn't expected such directness from a member of the royal family. Even at 8, Princess Charlotte had been taught proper etiquette and the importance of maintaining dignity in public situations. Yet here she was asking him a deeply personal question as if they were old friends. Prince George placed a gentle hand on his sister's arm. "Charlotte, we talked about this. The guards can't answer when they're on duty. But that's silly, she replied, though she lowered her voice. How are we supposed to know if they're all right if we can't talk to them? James felt that crack in his emotional armor widen a little more. These children, raised in unimaginable privilege and groomed from birth for lives of public service, were showing more genuine concern for his well-being than most adults in his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Prince George seemed to understand his sister's frustration. We don't need to talk to know things, he said wisely. Sometimes you can tell how someone feels just by looking at them carefully. He turned back to James, and once again James felt that penetrating gaze, as if the young prince was reading a story written in the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself even while standing perfectly still. You have kind eyes, Prince George said suddenly, but they look tired, and a little lonely. The observation hit James like a physical blow. He had spent years perfecting his guard's mask, learning to show nothing, reveal nothing, be nothing more than a uniformed presence. Yet this child saw through all of that to something essential and true. The accuracy of the assessment was both disturbing and strangely comforting. Princess Charlotte had been studying James as well, her head tilted at an angle that reminded him painfully of his own daughter Emma when she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Do you have children?" she asked suddenly. "You have the same look Papa gets when he misses us during his long trips." Again, the directness and insight stunned James. He thought about Emma and Tom, about how long it had been since he had really connected with them, about the carefully polite phone calls and stilted weekend visits. These royal children, who barely knew him, had identified his deepest pain within minutes of conversation. Prince George noticed his sister's question had affected James somehow. The guard's rigid posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, and there was something different in his breathing. "We should let him get back to his work," Prince George said diplomatically, but there was understanding in his young voice. "Thank you for keeping us safe." As they began to walk away toward the stables, Princess Charlotte turned back and did something that completed the demolition of James's carefully constructed walls. She blew him a kiss, the same gesture she had seen her mother make toward crowds of well-wishers, but this one was personal and meant specifically for him. "Feel better soon," she called softly, her words barely audible but clear enough for James to hear. After they disappeared around the corner, James stood in his position for the remainder of his shift, but his mind was elsewhere. These children had seen him, really seen him in a way that even his own family had stopped doing years ago. They had looked past the uniform, past the rigid posture and the stern expression, and had somehow recognized the man underneath who was struggling, hurting, and incredibly lonely. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying. Wonderful because it meant he was still human, still capable of being reached. Terrifying because it made him acknowledge just how isolated he had become, how thoroughly he had withdrawn from meaningful human connection. That evening, James did something he hadn't done in months. He called his children, not because it was his scheduled day or because Sarah had reminded him about a school event, but because he wanted to hear their voices and tell them he loved them. Emma answered the phone, and he could hear the surprise in her voice when she realized it was him calling unexpectedly. "Dad, is everything okay?" The question broke his heart a little because it revealed how unusual his spontaneous contact had become. When had his children started assuming that unexpected calls meant bad news? "Everything's fine, sweetheart," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just wanted to hear how your day went. Tell me about school, about your friends, about anything you want to share." For the next hour, James listened to Emma and then Tom talk about their lives, their hopes, their small daily dramas and victories. He found himself really listening, not just waiting for the conversation to end so he could fulfill his parental obligation and hang up. He asked questions, laughed at their stories, and felt something inside himself beginning to thaw. When he finally said goodbye and hung up the phone, James realized that two children he barely knew had given him a gift more valuable than they could possibly understand. They had reminded him that connection was still possible, that his capacity for love and being loved hadn't been completely destroyed by years of emotional numbing. Prince George and Princess Charlotte had seen his loneliness and had responded with simple, genuine kindness. They had treated him as a person worthy of consideration and care, not because of his rank or role, but simply because he was a human being in their presence. As James prepared for bed that night, He found himself looking forward to tomorrow's shift not with resignation or duty, but with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that both delighted and worried James. Prince George had begun incorporating daily routes past James's post into his schedule. Sometimes he was alone with a tutor, other times with Princess Charlotte, and occasionally with Prince Louis, who at 6 years old was still too young to fully understand the significance of his brother's behavior but was happy to participate in what seemed like a game. The interactions remained brief and respectful of protocol, but they had developed a subtle communication system that spoke volumes without words. Prince George would offer a small nod of acknowledgement. James would allow the barest hint of a smile to touch his eyes, and somehow in those fleeting moments both felt seen and valued. Other guards had begun to notice. Sergeant Williams, James's immediate superior, had observed the unusual attention Prince George was paying to one particular post and had started asking questions. "Mitchell, you've been drawing some interesting attention lately," Williams said during their morning briefing. "The young prince seems to have taken a shine to your section of the courtyard." James kept his expression neutral. "I maintain my post according to regulations, Sergeant. I can't control where members of the royal family choose to walk." "That's not what I'm suggesting," Williams replied, his tone more curious than accusatory. "I'm just wondering if there's something I should know about." "Any conversations? Any interactions outside of normal protocol?" The question put James in an impossible position. Technically, he hadn't violated any rules. He hadn't spoken to Prince George, hadn't moved from his position, hadn't compromised security in any way. But he also couldn't deny that something meaningful was happening between them, something that went beyond the normal relationship between a guard and the people he was sworn to protect. "No conversations, Sergeant," James answered truthfully. "The prince sometimes acknowledges the guards with a nod. I believe he's been taught to show appreciation for our service." Williams studied James's face carefully. He had been in charge of palace security long enough to develop good instincts about his men, and something in James's demeanor suggested there was more to the story. But without any concrete violations to address, he had to let the matter rest. "Just remember, Mitchell, that maintaining appropriate distance is part of our job. We protect them by remaining professional and invisible. Too much familiarity can compromise that." "Understood, Sergeant." But even as James agreed with his superior's guidance, he felt a pang of loss at the thought of returning to complete invisibility. Prince George's recognition had awakened something in him that he wasn't ready to give up. That afternoon brought an encounter that changed everything. James was at his post when he heard raised voices from the direction of the private gardens. Through the elaborate iron fencing, he could see Prince George in what appeared to be a heated discussion with his private secretary, a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton who was known for her rigid adherence to schedule and protocol. "Your Highness, this behavior is becoming disruptive to your studies," she was saying in clipped, disapproving tones. "Your tutors have reported that you seem distracted, and your grandmother has expressed concerns about your recent fascination with the staff." Prince George's young voice was respectful but firm. "I don't understand what's wrong with being polite to the people who work here. Isn't that what Mama and Papa have taught us? There's a difference between politeness and familiarity, Your Highness. The Queen's Guard are not your playmates. They have serious responsibilities and you shouldn't be disrupting them with social visits." James felt his jaw tighten. The conversation was taking place just close enough for him to hear every word, and he could sense the frustration and hurt in Prince George's voice. The boy was being scolded for showing basic human kindness, for recognizing the guards as people rather than fixtures. "I'm not disrupting anyone," Prince George protested. "I just say hello. Sometimes Charlotte asks questions, but we never stay long and we never interfere with their work. The point, Your Highness, is that such interactions are inappropriate. These men have been trained to maintain professional distance. Your attention puts them in an uncomfortable position where they cannot respond appropriately." James wanted to call out that nothing could be further from the truth, that Prince George's attention had been the most comfortable, most human thing he had experienced in years. But of course he remained silent and motionless, a living statue observing a drama that concerned him directly, but in which he could not participate. Prince George was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice carried a maturity that seemed far beyond his 11 years. "Mrs. Pemberton, may I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Highness." When you walk through the castle every day, do you see the people who work here? I mean really see them, not just notice that they're there. The question seemed to catch the private secretary off guard. Well, I acknowledge them appropriately, Your Highness. That's not what I mean. Do you ever wonder if they're happy? If they miss their families? If they have problems or worries or dreams? Do you think about them as people who have lives outside of serving us? There was a long pause, and James found himself holding his breath, waiting for the answer. Your Highness, while such thoughts are charitable, they're not really relevant to our duties. We all have roles to play, and maintaining appropriate boundaries helps everyone fulfill their responsibilities effectively. But what if those boundaries make people feel invisible? What if being appropriate means being unkind? The question hung in the air like a challenge. James felt his chest tighten with emotion. This child, this future king, was fighting for his right to treat others with basic human dignity. He was risking official disapproval and adult displeasure to defend something as simple as acknowledging another person's existence. Mrs. Pemberton's voice became more stern. Your Highness, these are philosophical questions that are above your current level of education. What matters now is learning proper protocol and focusing on your studies. I must insist that you limit your interactions with the staff to what is strictly necessary. And if I don't? The question came out with quiet determination, and James realized he was witnessing something remarkable. Prince George was taking a stand, drawing a line in the sand over an issue of principle. At 11 years old, he was willing to face consequences rather than abandon what he believed was right. Then I will have to speak with your parents about this matter, Your Highness. They will need to address your attitude and ensure you understand the importance of maintaining proper relationships within the palace. James saw Prince George's shoulders straighten, saw him lift his chin in a gesture that reminded everyone watching that, despite his youth, he carried royal blood and an innate understanding of authority. Then you should speak with them, Mrs. Pemberton. I would be interested to hear what they have to say about showing kindness to the people who dedicate their lives to protecting our family. The private secretary seemed taken aback by the prince's composed response. She had clearly expected capitulation, not dignified resistance. Very well, Your Highness. We shall see what the Prince and Princess of Wales have to say about this matter. As the two figures walked away from the garden, James remained at his post, but his mind was reeling. Prince George had just put his relationship with his parents, his standing with the palace staff, and his reputation for good behavior on the line, all for the right to acknowledge James and the other guards as human beings. The weight of that sacrifice was almost unbearable. This child, who would someday be king, had chosen to risk conflict and consequences rather than treat James as furniture. The gesture was so pure, so selfless, and so unnecessary from anyone else's perspective, that it completely overwhelmed James's carefully maintained emotional defenses. For the first time in years, James felt tears building behind his eyes as he stood at attention in the courtyard of Windsor Castle. A 11-year-old boy had just fought for him, had defended his dignity and humanity against adult authority figures who thought such things were irrelevant luxuries. Standing there in his red uniform, rifle at the ready, James realized that Prince George had given him something infinitely more valuable than recognition or acknowledgement. He had given him hope that kindness still mattered, that seeing others as fully human was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to treat another person as invisible. That evening, James made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. James spent a sleepless night staring at his bedroom ceiling, replaying Prince George's confrontation with Mrs. Pemberton over and over in his mind. The boy's courage and conviction had shaken something loose inside him, something he hadn't felt since his early days in the military, when he still believed that doing the right thing mattered more than following orders blindly. By morning, James had reached a conclusion that surprised him with its clarity. He couldn't continue to be the cause of Prince George's troubles with the palace hierarchy. The boy had shown him extraordinary kindness and had even fought for the right to treat him as a human being. But James couldn't let a child sacrifice his standing within his own family for the sake of a damaged guard who had forgotten how to connect with people. More importantly, Prince George's example had shown James what he had been missing in his own life. The boy's willingness to see him, really see him, had reminded James of what it felt like to be valued as a person rather than just a function. But it had also made him realize how long it had been since he had extended that same courtesy to others, including his own children. When James arrived at the castle that morning, he found Sergeant Williams waiting for him at the guard station. "Mitchell, I need to speak with you before you take your post," Williams said, his expression serious. "There's been some discussion at higher levels about the situation with Prince George." James felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of discussion, Sergeant?" "The kind where people in expensive suits ask questions about whether certain guards are maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. The kind where words like reassignment and review of duties get mentioned." The threat was clear, and James realized that his fears about causing trouble for Prince George had been well-founded. The palace hierarchy was taking notice, and they weren't pleased with the unusual attention the young prince had been paying to one particular guard. "I understand, Sergeant. What are my options?" William studied James's face carefully. "You're a good soldier, Mitchell. 12 years of exemplary service, excellent ratings, no disciplinary issues. Nobody wants to see you get into trouble over something that probably isn't even your fault. Kids are naturally curious, and Prince George seems like a particularly thoughtful boy. But the easiest solution would be to rotate you to a different post. Maybe the night shift or one of the outer perimeters where there's less chance of casual interaction with the royal family. Let things cool down for a while, and eventually everyone forgets this ever happened." The suggestion made perfect sense from a practical standpoint, but it felt like a betrayal of everything Prince George had tried to defend. Moving James to avoid the boy's kindness would send a clear message that such behavior was inappropriate and should be discouraged. "What if I don't want to be rotated, Sergeant?" Williams raised an eyebrow. "Then you need to make absolutely certain that there are no further incidents that could be interpreted as inappropriate familiarity. No acknowledgments, no smiles, no reactions at all. Complete professional invisibility. And if Prince George continues to try to interact, then you ignore him completely. You look through him like he doesn't exist, the same way you would with any other civilian who tried to distract you from your duties." The idea of treating Prince George like a distraction, of deliberately ignoring the kindness and recognition the boy had shown him, made James feel physically sick. It would be like slapping a child who had offered him a gift. "I'll think about it, Sergeant." "Don't think too long, Mitchell. These decisions have a way of being made for you if you wait too long to make them yourself." James took his position at the main entrance with William's words echoing in his mind. He had perhaps hours, maybe days, before he would be forced to choose between his career and his conscience, between following orders and honoring the dignity that Prince George had fought to preserve for him. He didn't have to wait long for the situation to come to a head. Prince George appeared in the courtyard shortly after 10 o'clock, walking with his father, the Prince of Wales. James could see immediately that this wasn't a casual stroll. The prince's father was speaking to him in low, serious tones, and Prince George was listening with the careful attention of a child who knows he's in trouble. They stopped directly in front of James's post, close enough that he could hear every word of their conversation. "George, I understand that Mrs. Pemberton spoke with you yesterday about your interactions with the guards," the Prince of Wales began, his voice carrying the careful tone of a parent trying to be fair but firm. "Yes, Papa. She's concerned that you may not fully understand the appropriate boundaries between our family and the people who work here. Can you explain to me why you think it's important to socialize with the guards?" James felt his chest tighten as he waited for Prince George's response. The boy was being asked to justify his kindness, to explain why he thought treating others as human beings was important. Prince George was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice was steady but carried an undertone of sadness that made James's heart ache. "Papa, do you remember when you used to tell me and Charlotte stories about Grandmama Diana? About how she would talk to homeless people and hold babies with AIDS and make everyone feel like they mattered?" The Prince of Wales seemed taken aback by the reference to his late mother. "Yes, I remember those stories. You said she believed that everyone deserved to be seen and valued, not just the important people. You said that's what made her special, that she could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room." James could see the Prince of Wales struggling with his son's reasoning. Prince George was using his grandmother's example as justification for his behavior, and it was clearly effective. "That's true, son. But there are also protocols and traditions that help maintain order and respect. The guards have important jobs to do, and we don't want to distract them from their duties." But Papa, I've never distracted anyone from their duties. I just say hello or nod to show that I notice them. Isn't that what Grandmama Diana would have done? The question hung in the air between father and son, and James could see the Prince of Wales wrestling with conflicting impulses. As a father, he was clearly proud of his son's compassionate instincts. As a member of the royal family, he understood the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries and following established protocols. Prince George seemed to sense his father's internal conflict and pressed his advantage with the wisdom of a child who understood adults better than they realized. Papa, that guard there, he said, gesturing discreetly toward James. He has sad eyes. I can see it even when he's trying to look stern and professional. He looks like he misses someone, maybe his children. When I acknowledge him, his eyes get a little less sad. How can that be wrong? The observation was so accurate and so compassionately expressed that James felt tears threatening behind his professional mask. This child had seen through all his defenses to the core of his pain and loneliness, and he was trying to explain to his father why simple human kindness mattered more than protocol. The Prince of Wales looked at James, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time in all the years James had been stationed at the castle. James could feel the royal assessment, the intelligent evaluation of a man who had been trained from birth to read people and situations. What the Prince of Wales saw in James's face seemed to give him pause. After a long moment, he turned back to his son with something that looked like understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. George, why don't you go inside and find your sister? I think it's time for your music lesson. Yes, Papa, but are we still discussing this? About the guards? The Prince of Wales looked once more at James, then back at his son. Yes, we're still discussing it. But I think I need to have a different kind of conversation first. As Prince George walked toward the castle entrance, he passed close enough to James to whisper, so quietly that only James could hear, I'm sorry if I got you in trouble. I just wanted you to know that someone sees you. The words hit James like a physical blow to the chest. This child was apologizing for showing him kindness, was worried that his compassion had caused problems for someone else. The generosity of spirit required for such concern was almost more than James could process. After Prince George disappeared into the castle, the Prince of Wales remained in the courtyard, his thoughtful gaze fixed on James. The moment stretched on uncomfortably long, and James began to wonder if he was about to be dressed down by the future king himself. But when the Prince of Wales finally spoke, his words were the last thing James expected to hear. Sergeant Mitchell, isn't it? The Prince of Wales said, his voice carrying none of the formal distance James had expected. I believe you served in Afghanistan before joining the Palace Guard. James was startled to be addressed directly, and even more surprised that the Prince of Wales knew details about his background. Yes, Your Highness. 2 tours with the Welsh Guards. At ease, Sergeant, the Prince of Wales said, and James relaxed his rigid posture slightly. I'd like to speak with you if you don't mind. Not as your commanding officer, but as a father trying to understand my son. The request was so unexpected that James wasn't sure how to respond. In 12 years of service, he had never had a personal conversation with any member of the royal family, and he certainly hadn't expected his first to be about Prince George's kindness toward him. Of course, Your Highness, the Prince of Wales gestured toward a bench in the courtyard, out of earshot of other guards and staff members. Please sit with me. James followed, feeling surreal about the entire situation. Just yesterday, he had been an invisible guardian, and now he was being invited to sit and chat with the future king about his relationship with Prince George. My son sees something in you that has moved him to break protocol. Repeatedly, the Prince of Wales began, his tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. He's willing to face consequences and disapproval from adults he respects, all for the right to acknowledge you as a person. That tells me something significant is happening here. James chose his words carefully. Your son is an extraordinary young man, Your Highness. He has a gift for seeing people, really seeing them. It's meant more to me than I can properly express. Tell me about your family, Sergeant. Do you have children? The question caught James off guard, but he found himself answering honestly. 2 children, Your Highness. Emma is 14 and Tom is 12. They live with their mother in Manchester. You miss them? It wasn't a question, and James realized that the Prince of Wales had seen the same thing in his face that Prince George had recognized, The longing, the sadness, the weight of separation from the people who mattered most. Every day, Your Highness. And my son somehow recognized that pain and chose to respond to it with kindness. Yes, Your Highness. He has a remarkable capacity for empathy. He saw something that even I thought I had hidden completely. The Prince of Wales was quiet for a moment, seeming to process this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of pride mixed with concern. George has always been sensitive to others' emotions. Sometimes I worry it will be a burden for him, given the role he'll eventually have to fulfill. A king must be compassionate, but he also must maintain appropriate distance. It's a difficult balance, James nodded, understanding the dilemma. If I may say so, Your Highness, your son's instinct to treat others with dignity and recognition seems like exactly the quality the monarchy will need in the future. People want to feel seen and valued by their leaders, perhaps, but there are also centuries of protocol and tradition to consider. The palace hierarchy exists for reasons that aren't always obvious to an 11-year-old boy. With respect, Your Highness, sometimes an 11-year-old boy can see things that adults have forgotten how to notice. The Prince of Wales looked at James with sharp attention. Such as? James took a deep breath, knowing he was about to speak more freely than he ever had with anyone connected to the royal family. Such as the fact that kindness doesn't diminish authority, it enhances it. Your son hasn't disrupted my duties or compromised security by acknowledging me. If anything, his recognition has made me more committed to protecting him and your family, not less. How so? Because he's reminded me that I'm protecting real people, not just symbols or institutions. He's made the job personal in the best possible way. When someone shows you that level of human consideration, you would do anything to keep them safe. The Prince of Wales seemed to consider this perspective carefully. The palace staff is concerned that George's behavior sets a precedent that could become problematic. If every member of the royal family started engaging personally with guards and staff, it could create complications. But Your Highness, there's a difference between inappropriate familiarity and simple human acknowledgement. Your son has never overstepped bounds or created uncomfortable situations. He simply refused to treat people as if they don't exist. Mrs. Pemberton believes that maintaining professional distance is essential for proper functioning of the palace. James felt a surge of protective anger on Prince George's behalf. Mrs. Pemberton has never served in combat, Your Highness. She's never been in situations where recognizing someone's humanity was the difference between life and death. Your son understands something that many adults have forgotten. Seeing people as individuals doesn't weaken institutional structure. It strengthens it. The Prince of Wales studied James's face intently. You feel strongly about this. I do, Your Highness. Your son gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. He reminded me that I'm still a person worth noticing, worth caring about. That gift has changed how I see myself and how I relate to others, including my own children. Tell me about that. James hesitated, unsure how much personal detail was appropriate to share. But the Prince of Wales' expression was genuinely interested rather than merely polite. I had become emotionally distant from everyone in my life, Your Highness. The war, the divorce, the isolation of this job. I had built walls that I thought protected me but really just made me invisible to the people I loved. Your son's simple acknowledgement cracked those walls. It reminded me that connection is still possible, that I'm still capable of feeling and being felt. And that's helped you with Emma and Tom? James was surprised that the Prince of Wales remembered his children's names. Yes, Your Highness. For the first time in years, I've been calling them just to talk. Not because it was scheduled or required. I've been really listening to their lives, asking questions, showing interest in who they're becoming as people. The Prince of Wales smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of thing my mother would have said was important. She believed that the greatest gift you could give someone was your complete attention, your recognition of their individual worth. Your son has that same gift, Your Highness. Yes, he does, and perhaps that's something to be celebrated rather than discouraged. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the morning activity around the castle grounds. James felt as though a weight was lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something he hadn't dared to hope for, understanding and support from the very highest levels. Sergeant Mitchell, may I ask you something personal? Of course, Your Highness. If George continues to acknowledge you and the other guards in his characteristic way, will you be able to maintain your professional standards while still honoring his gesture of respect? James considered the question carefully. Yes, Your Highness. I believe I can. Your son has never asked for anything inappropriate, never demanded responses that would compromise my duties. He simply wants to treat the people around him as human beings. I can accept that kindness while still fulfilling my responsibilities to protect your family. The Prince of Wales nodded slowly. Then perhaps we can find a way to support George's instincts while still maintaining the necessary protocols. James felt a surge of hope mixed with gratitude. Your Highness, if I may say so, you're raising a son who will be an extraordinary king. His capacity for compassion, his willingness to fight for what's right even when adults disagree with him, those are the qualities that will serve the monarchy and the country well in the future. Thank you, Sergeant. That means more to me than you might realize. As the Prince of Wales stood to leave, he turned back to James with a slight smile. By the way, I'll be having a conversation with Mrs. Pemberton about the importance of balancing protocol with compassion. I think she may benefit from a reminder that the royal family's greatest strength has always been our ability to connect with people, not our ability to remain distant from them. James stood and returned to attention as the Prince of Wales walked away, but his heart was lighter than it had been in years. Prince George's simple gesture of recognition had not only changed James's life, but had apparently reminded his father of important values that sometimes got lost in the complexity of royal duty. That afternoon, James received an unexpected visitor at his post. Prince George approached with Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, and this time there was no adult hurrying them along or warning them about appropriate behavior. Hello, Prince George said simply, his young face bright with relief and happiness. Papa said I could properly introduce myself. I'm George. For the first time in 12 years of palace service, James allowed himself to smile fully while on duty. Hello, Your Highness. I'm Sergeant Mitchell. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for letting me, Prince George replied, and in those words, James heard the echo of his grandmother Diana's famous ability to make everyone feel like the most important person in the room. Standing there in his red uniform, surrounded by 3 young royals who had chosen to treat him as a friend rather than furniture, James realized that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the smallest gestures of human kindness. The weeks following James's conversation with the Prince of Wales brought changes throughout the palace that no one could have anticipated. Word of Prince George's successful campaign for basic human recognition had spread quietly through the staff quarters, creating ripples of hope and renewed dignity among people who had grown accustomed to being invisible. Mrs. Pemberton, after her private meeting with the Prince of Wales, had emerged with a notably different attitude toward what she now referred to as appropriate courtesy, rather than professional distance. While she maintained her commitment to protocol, she began acknowledging staff members by name and occasionally asking about their well-being. More significantly, other members of the royal family had begun following Prince George's example. Princess Charlotte had always been naturally friendly, but now she felt free to express her curiosity about the people around her without fear of adult disapproval. Prince Louis, still young enough to be naturally social, delighted in learning the names of guards and staff members and greeting them with enthusiastic waves. Even the adults had begun to change their behavior. The Princess of Wales, who had always been known for her warmth, started making more deliberate efforts to connect personally with palace employees during her daily routines. The Prince of Wales occasionally stopped to chat briefly with guards and staff, asking about their families or expressing appreciation for their service. But it was James who experienced the most profound transformation. Prince George's gift of recognition had unlocked something in him that had been dormant for years. The ability to see and connect with others as fully realized human beings, rather than just functional relationships. His renewed relationship with his children had deepened significantly. Emma and Tom had initially been surprised by their father's increased attention and emotional availability, but they had quickly embraced the change. Phone calls that had once been awkward obligations had become genuine conversations filled with laughter, shared concerns, and mutual interest. James had even begun the difficult process of rebuilding his relationship with his ex-wife Sarah. While romantic reconciliation wasn't possible, they had found a way to co-parent that was based on respect and shared commitment to their children's well-being, rather than old resentments and hurt feelings. At the palace, James's colleagues had noticed his transformation. He had become more engaged with his fellow guards, more willing to offer help or support when needed, and generally more present in his interactions with others. The change was subtle but significant, and it had begun to influence the atmosphere among the entire guard unit. Sergeant Williams had observed these changes with professional interest and personal satisfaction. He had seen too many good soldiers lose themselves to trauma and isolation, and James's recovery was deeply gratifying to witness. "Mitchell, you seem different lately," Williams said during one of their routine briefings. "More present, I suppose. Whatever's changed, it's good to see." James considered how to explain the transformation without going into details about Prince George's role in his recovery. "I've been working on reconnecting with people, Sergeant, remembering that relationships matter more than I had let myself believe. Well, it shows, and it's having an effect on the other men as well. Morale has been better these past few weeks." The observation pleased James because it confirmed something he had begun to suspect. Prince George's simple gesture of recognition had created a chain reaction of positive change that extended far beyond their original interaction, but James was also beginning to feel a growing sense of internal conflict about his role at the palace. Prince George's example had reminded him not only of his capacity for connection, but also of his desire to live a life that aligned more closely with his values. The rigid structure and emotional constraints of palace service, while providing stability and purpose, no longer felt like the right fit for who he was becoming. He found himself thinking more frequently about civilian careers that would allow him to use his skills in more personally meaningful ways. Veteran services, counseling, community work, possibilities that had never occurred to him during his years of emotional numbness but now seemed like natural extensions of his renewed sense of purpose and connection. The catalyst for his decision came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Prince George approached his post with an expression of obvious distress. The boy's usual bright demeanor was replaced by something that looked like sadness mixed with guilt. "Sergeant Mitchell," Prince George said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "May I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Highness. Do you think I've caused problems for you by insisting on treating you like a person? I heard some of the staff talking, and they seemed to think that my behavior had created difficulties." James felt his heart break a little at the question. This compassionate child was worried that his kindness had been a burden, that his refusal to treat others as invisible had somehow damaged the people he had tried to help. "Your Highness," James said carefully, "you have never caused problems for me. Quite the opposite, actually. You've given me back something I thought I had lost forever." "What's that?" "The understanding that I matter as a person, not just as someone who performs a function. You reminded me that I'm worth seeing, worth acknowledging, worth caring about. That gift has changed my entire life." Prince George's face brightened slightly, but the concern didn't completely disappear. "But some people think I shouldn't have done it. They think there are more important things than treating people kindly." James chose his next words very carefully, knowing they would be among the most important things he would ever say to this remarkable young man. "Your Highness, there is nothing more important than treating people kindly. Nothing. The people who tell you otherwise have forgotten something essential about what it means to be human. Your instinct to see and value others is not a weakness or a problem. It's your greatest strength. Even if it makes things complicated, especially if it makes things complicated. The easy path is to treat people as if they don't matter, to ignore their humanity for the sake of convenience or tradition. The difficult path is to insist that everyone deserves recognition and respect, even when that challenges the way things have always been done. You've chosen the difficult path because it's the right path." Prince George was quiet for a moment, processing James's words. When he spoke again, his voice carried a maturity that continued to amaze James. "Sergeant Mitchell, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, Your Highness." "Sometimes I worry that when I become king, I'll have to stop seeing people the way I do now. That I'll have to become distant and formal and treat everyone like they're just part of the furniture." James felt a surge of protective concern for this thoughtful child who was already grappling with the weight of his future responsibilities. "Your Highness, I believe that your ability to see and value people will make you an extraordinary king. The world needs leaders who remember that power exists to serve others, not to elevate themselves above others. Your compassion isn't something you'll need to abandon. It's something the monarchy needs you to bring to the role." "Do you really think so?" "I know so. You've already proven that treating people with dignity and respect makes them more committed to serving you, not less. You've shown that kindness strengthens relationships rather than weakening them. Those are the qualities that will define great leadership in the future. Prince George smiled, and James could see some of the worry lifting from his young shoulders. But James also realized that this conversation had crystallized his own decision about his future. "Your Highness," James said slowly, "I want you to know that your example has inspired me to make some changes in my own life. Changes that will help me live more in alignment with the values you've taught me." "What kind of changes?" James took a deep breath, surprised by the clarity of his own decision. "I'm going to leave the palace guard, Your Highness. I'm going to find work that allows me to help other people the way you've helped me." Prince George's eyes widened with surprise and what looked like disappointment. "But why? Have I caused problems after all?" "No, Your Highness. You've caused solutions. You've reminded me that I have more to offer the world than just standing guard. You've shown me that connecting with people and helping them feel seen and valued is the most important work anyone can do. I want to find ways to do that work more directly. What will you do?" "I'm not entirely sure yet. Maybe work with other veterans who are struggling with the kind of isolation I experienced. Maybe find ways to help people who feel invisible or forgotten. The specific job doesn't matter as much as the purpose. Using what you've taught me to help others feel as valued as you made me feel." Prince George was quiet for a long moment, and James could see him processing the implications of their conversation. When he finally spoke, his words carried a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. "I understand, Sergeant Mitchell, and I think it's wonderful. You're going to help other people feel seen just like Grandmama Diana used to do." The reference to his grandmother brought tears to James's eyes. Prince George had made the connection between his own compassionate instincts, his grandmother's legacy, and James's future path of service to others. "Yes, Your Highness. Exactly like that. Will you write to me sometimes? I'd like to know about the people you help." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It would be my honor, Your Highness." As Prince George walked away from their final conversation as guard and future king, James realized that the boy's quiet gesture of recognition had not only saved him from a life of emotional isolation, it had given him a new purpose and direction that felt more meaningful than anything he had ever imagined possible. Standing at his post for one of the last times, James understood that Prince George's gift had been far more than simple acknowledgement. It had been an invitation to remember his own humanity, and to use that remembrance in service of others who had forgotten theirs. The revolution of kindness that had begun with the child's wave was about to expand into the world beyond the palace walls. 6 months after James Mitchell submitted his resignation from the Queen's Guard, he stood in a small community center in Manchester, surrounded by a group of military veterans who had gathered for their weekly support meeting. The transition from palace service to civilian life had been challenging, but every day brought confirmation that he had made the right choice. James had used his military experience and newfound understanding of human connection to establish a program for veterans struggling with isolation, depression, and the difficulty of reintegrating into civilian society. The program, which he had named Seen and Valued, focused on the simple but powerful principle that Prince George had taught him. Everyone deserves recognition as a fully realized human being. The work was demanding in ways that standing guard had never been. Each veteran who came through the program carried unique wounds and struggles, requiring James to be emotionally present and engaged in ways that his palace service had never demanded. But it was also deeply fulfilling in ways he had never experienced during his years of rigid professional duty. "The thing people don't understand about coming home," said Marcus, a former Royal Marine who had lost his leg in Syria, "is that nobody sees you anymore. You go from being essential, being part of something important, to being just another guy with problems that make people uncomfortable." James nodded, understanding the feeling completely. That invisibility is one of the hardest parts of the transition. You start to question whether you actually matter as a person, or if you were only valuable as a soldier. "Exactly," said Sarah, one of the few women in the group, a former army medic who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. "My family means well, but they treat me like I'm broken, like I need to be handled carefully. They don't see the person I am now. They only see the trauma they think I'm carrying." James had learned that his role in these conversations wasn't to provide easy answers or quick fixes. but to create space for people to feel heard and understood. Prince George's gift to him had been recognition and acknowledgement, and James was now offering that same gift to others who felt invisible or diminished. "What helped me," James said, sharing a story he had told many times but that never lost its power, "was when someone saw past my role and my defenses to the person underneath. Someone who recognized that I was struggling, that I was lonely, and that I mattered beyond just the job I was doing." "Who was that?" asked David, a younger veteran who had recently joined the group. James smiled, still amazed by the unlikely source of his transformation. "A child, actually. An 11-year-old boy who refused to treat me like furniture, who insisted on acknowledging me as a person even when adults told him it was inappropriate." The group had heard variations of this story before, but they never grew tired of it. The idea that a child's simple gesture of recognition could change an adult's entire life resonated with people who felt forgotten or overlooked by a society that had moved on from the conflicts they had served in. "How did he know you needed that?" Sarah asked. "I think he just paid attention. He looked at people carefully enough to see beyond their roles to who they actually were. Most adults had trained themselves not to look that closely, but children haven't learned to ignore what's right in front of them." James's phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced down to see a familiar name on the screen. Emma, his daughter, was sending him a photo from her school's drama production where she was playing the lead role. The image showed her in costume, beaming with pride and excitement. The relationship James had rebuilt with his children remained one of the most precious outcomes of Prince George's influence on his life. Emma and Tom visited him regularly now, and their conversations had depth and warmth that had been missing for years. They had gone from seeing their father as a distant obligation to experiencing him as a fully present parent who was genuinely interested in their lives. "Sorry," James said to the group, showing them the photo. "My daughter's in her school play tonight. She's playing Juliet in Romeo and Juliet." The group smiled at the obvious pride in his voice. Many of them had their own fractured relationships with family members, and James's successful reconciliation with his children offered hope that healing was possible. "Are you going to see the play?" Marcus asked. "Absolutely. I wouldn't miss it for anything." This response would have been unthinkable during James's years of emotional isolation, when he had regularly missed important events in his children's lives because engaging felt too difficult and painful. Now, being present for the people he loved felt like the most natural thing in the world. After the group session ended, James drove to Emma's school for the evening performance. As he sat in the auditorium watching his daughter transform into Shakespeare's tragic heroine, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of connection and pride. During intermission, he stepped outside to check his messages and found an email that made his heart skip. The sender was listed as HRH Prince George, and the subject line read, "Update from the Palace." James opened the message with curiosity and growing emotion. "Dear Sergeant Mitchell, I hope you are well and happy in your new work. Papa told me about your program for veterans, and I wanted you to know how proud I am that you're helping people feel seen and valued. It sounds exactly like the kind of work Grandmama Diana would have loved. I wanted to share some news from the palace. Remember how you said that treating people with kindness makes them more committed, not less? You were right. The guards and staff seem happier now that everyone feels more free to acknowledge each other as people. Mrs. Pemberton even learned the names of all the kitchen staff and asks about their families. Charlotte says, I should tell you that she's been practicing your approach with everyone we meet. She calls it seeing people properly. Louis is too young to understand the theory, but he's naturally good at making everyone feel important. I think about our conversations often, especially when I have lessons about leadership and what it means to serve others. My tutors are teaching me about the history of the monarchy, but you taught me something they couldn't. That real leadership means making sure everyone knows they matter. I hope the people in your program know how lucky they are to have someone who understands what it feels like to be invisible and who remembers what it means to be truly seen. Please give my regards to your children. Papa says family is the most important thing, and I'm glad you're able to be close to yours now. Your friend, George P.S. I'm enclosing a small donation for your program from my personal allowance. I hope it helps you reach more people who need to feel valued. Attached to the email was information about a substantial donation to James's program. far more than any child's allowance could account for. James realized that Prince George had likely spoken to his parents about supporting the work, and they had honored their son's request to help. Standing outside his daughter's school, reading words of encouragement and support from a future king, who was still just a teenager, James felt overwhelmed by the continuing ripples of that first moment of recognition in the palace courtyard. Prince George's simple gesture had not only saved James from a life of isolation, it had created a chain of positive change that continued to expand in ways none of them could have predicted. When the play resumed, James watched his daughter deliver Juliet's final monologue with a depth of attention and appreciation that would have been impossible during his years of emotional numbness. Every word, every gesture, every expression on her face felt precious and significant because he had learned to really see the people he loved. After the performance, as Emma hugged him with excitement and pride, James thought about the letter he would write back to Prince George. He would tell the young man about Marcus finding the courage to reconnect with his estranged brother, about Sarah starting college to become a counselor, about David discovering his talent for woodworking and beginning to heal through creative expression. More importantly, he would tell Prince George that his childhood lesson about the power of recognition had grown into something larger than either of them had imagined. The program now served over 200 veterans, and James had begun training other counselors to expand the approach to different communities. But perhaps most significantly, he would tell Prince George that every person who learned to feel seen and valued went on to offer that same gift to others. The revolution of kindness that had begun with a royal child's refusal to treat a palace guard as invisible had become a movement of people committed to ensuring that no one had to feel forgotten or diminished. As James drove home that night, with Emma chattering excitedly about the performance and making plans for their weekend together, he realized that Prince George had given him far more than recognition or acknowledgement. The young prince had given him back his life, his relationships, and his sense of purpose. And in the quiet moments before sleep, James said a prayer of gratitude for an 11-year-old boy who had possessed the wisdom to see what adults had missed, the courage to act on his convictions despite opposition, and the kindness to change one man's life with nothing more than a simple gesture of human recognition. The palace guard had resigned, but the man Prince George had helped him rediscover was just beginning to live.